For a little over 2 years now, we've been on a journey together here at First Congregational United Church of Christ in the city of Portland. We have journeyed together as pastor and congregation in an intentional interim ministry. When I first began here a little over 2 years ago, I used the metaphor of journeying through the wilderness in my very first sermon to describe the experience of being in an intentional interim ministry. And like the ancient Hebrews, an interim period between two settled pastors can feel a lot like wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. At first, the journey may feel meandering and even disorienting, but there's purpose in all that wandering. God knows what she's doing. It takes time, you see, to grieve and let go of the past, of the way things were. It takes time to heal and make space for the newness that is waiting to be born out of the chaos. It takes time to get to the promised land, as you might say, the promised land of the new settled pastor and the new era that awaits you. Well, we wandered for the past 2 years, you might say, but we wandered with a purpose to reach the fresh future that God has in store for you. And as we journeyed through these last 2 years, we trust that we have been led by a presence, a gently insistent spirit who continually lured us forward and fed us with manna in the desert. And like the Israelites of old, you revisited your roots and you honed your identity. You developed your sense of mission and you affirmed your covenant with God to be God's people in this place. And like all good Congregationalists, you actually have a covenant that you created to affirm your values and your identity as the particular people of God gathered in the city of Portland. And in your case, I can actually say that you have an excellent covenant. I work with a clergy mentor from time to time, and he has a practice of looking at the church covenant of the pastors that he's working with. And he has said to me on more than one occasion that you have one of the best church covenants that he has seen. That's really saying something because he works with a lot of clergy and a lot of churches. Well, over the course of the past 2 years, you may recall that we have spent some time reflecting on your covenant. We had a congregational session last July where we gathered around tables and really worked through the covenant and talked about where we're hitting the mark and where you might be missing the mark. What in your covenant is really descriptive of you now and what might be more aspirational. It was a wonderful session. And the transition team subsequently held smaller group listening sessions to listen for your hopes and your dreams. And we listened to different groups, including parents of children. And in all these ways, the transition team was listening for the way in which you manifest your covenantal identity and your mission. And they used the covenant and all of that wonderful insight that they gathered from listening to you as they wrote the local church profile. And that, of course, is what helped the search committee call your new pastor, the Reverend Eric Elness. Well, when Reverend Michael and Elizabeth were here, you may remember that they would give out compasses to graduating seniors in high school. And a compass is a symbol of something which helps you find your way in the world. And you might think of a covenant as a compass. It will help you stay on track and find true north as you embark on a new journey with a new pastor. So I think it's a good time to revisit your covenant during my last sermons with you before I leave and depart from being your interim minister at the end of October. Because your covenant identifies your core values and your most important commitments. The full covenant is printed at the bottom of the bulletin, which was emailed to you if you have signed up to receive those emails, and you can take a look at that. Well, for today, we're going to be exploring the meaning of your commitment to, quote, nurture our relationships with one another through our listening and our caring. As we reflect on what it looks like to nurture your relationships through listening and caring, we come across a different kind of journey. In her groundbreaking book, The Journey is Home, feminist theologian and educator Nell Morton wrote this: maybe journey is not so much a journey ahead or a journey into space, but a journey into presence. The farthest place on earth, Morton writes, is the journey into the presence of the nearest person to you. That's worth thinking about for a moment. The farthest place on earth is the journey into the presence of the nearest person to you. We think we know one another, don't we? We think we know our spouses and our children, our parents and our friends. But the truth is, we barely know ourselves. We talk a lot in the United Church of Christ about Jesus's commandment to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. But how much damage do we do because we think we know what our neighbor needs before even listening to hear them speak for themselves? And so, unfortunately, Christians often have the well-deserved reputation of imposing our own beliefs and value systems onto our neighbors without first asking what they understand their needs to be and really, truly listening to them. Well, by recognizing that we need to listen to one another in order to truly care for one another, we take a big step. But what does it really mean to listen, to truly hear one another? Nell Morton, who wrote the book, The Journey is Home, from which we got our modern testimony for today, she experienced an epiphany about hearing by spending time in small groups of women who were coming together for nurture and support and consciousness raising in the 1970s. And she experienced what she called a complete reversal of the going logic in which someone speaks precisely so that more accurate hearing may take place. In other words, most of us, she thought, see hearing as a one-way speech. There's speaking, that's what happens first, and then there's hearing. Makes sense, right? But Morton experienced something profoundly different in these small groups of women struggling to find their voice for the first time, to tell their stories. Because as is often the case, especially with people who, for whatever reason, because of gender or sexual orientation or race, different kinds of marginalization through trauma or abuse or life experience have not been able to access their true selves or find their voice, they need something more than ordinary listening. Morton said that she and other women were sensing into something that she called a depth hearing that takes place even before the speaking, a hearing that is far more than acute listening. And she said that this was a hearing that was engaged in by the whole body. It's a hearing we do with our whole body, our whole selves. And as we engage in that kind of attentive, loving, caring, and empathic hearing, a new speech is evoked, what she called a new creation. And she called this phenomenon hearing one another into speech. It was such a profound concept that at the time, and I can remember being in seminary in the early 80s, and we were still feeling the ripple effects of this revelation by Nell Morton, that there was something called hearing one another into speech. And so women and men, we tried to learn from that, how to hear one another's voices in a different way. Have you ever been heard into speech? I'd invite you to think for a moment. Has there ever been a time when someone was able to be that listening ear for you, that caring, attentive presence that allowed your shy, vulnerable soul to appear and to be heard, that enabled you to come to some kind of epiphany about yourself that you couldn't have gotten in the echo chamber of your own mind, of your own internal monologue, but you needed someone, some loving other to hear you into speech? I can remember a time like that. The first time I experienced this was in high school. One of my best friends was really good about listening to me as I was wrestling with a growing sense of being called by God to something that I could not name. I had a sense deep in my heart that God had a purpose for me, and of course God has a purpose for everyone, but I had a sense that I needed to discover a very particular purpose that God had for me in the world, but I couldn't see or hear clearly what that purpose was. Now, this was the early 80s, and I had never met a female minister. I had never considered ordination as an option. So I thought a lot about Christian education work or teaching or becoming a foreign missionary, all kinds of things like that. But I didn't think about putting on a stole and getting into a pulpit and preaching, or about the more profound ways of being pastor to people that we get trained to do when we take on the role of being an ordained minister. But my friend somehow was able to gently and patiently listen, to reflect back to me what she heard, and to ask reflective questions. And so I'll never forget the day when we were in the middle of a tennis game, and somehow batting the ball back and forth, we were continuing this dialogue, and she stopped dead in her tracks and said, "Janet, why don't you just become a minister?" And I stopped, and I remember my racket just kind of falling loose by my side, and I literally was stunned because it had never occurred to me that I could be a minister. My friend's deep hearing allowed me to stumble into a recognition of a call to ordained ministry in a world where I would mostly experience opposition to this call and this dream for a number of years. But underneath my friend's hearing, I recognized that an even deeper listening was going on. A listening that was happening all the time when I was conscious of it and when I was unconscious of it. Foundational to all of our hearing is the hearing by the one that Morton calls the great ear at the heart of the universe, at the heart of our common life. The great ear hearing human beings to speech. This is, of course, the God whom the prophets knew, whom Jesus knew, the one who promised Jeremiah, "You will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you." Now think about this for a moment. Imagine God as the one who hears before God speaks, who doesn't just speak the world into being out of the mind of God, as we normally think, but who first listens, who listens to the shape that the world yearns to take in the world and hears it into being. What if the world emerges not out of God's imposed will, but out of a listening and loving heart, allowing creation to emerge from its inarticulate chaos into meaningful and liberating speech? Well, if you can imagine this, can you also begin to imagine what the church could be? We who are called to body forth Christ in the world and Christ's love for the world. Morton also reminds us in another part of her book that the first Pentecost, and we are still in the season of Pentecost, by the way, the first Pentecost demonstrated that the work of the Spirit was actually hearing before speaking. Think about it. Before the disciples witnessed to the crowds, to the good news of Jesus's life, death, and resurrection, before Peter got up and started that famous first sermon in Jerusalem, the disciples first listened. They listened as the Spirit gave voice through many, many, many languages to the good news of God. It bubbled up in the hearts of those who were gathered for the festival of Pentecost. And so the Pentecost, the first Christian Pentecost, was a Pentecost of hearing God breaking forth into miraculous speech. Well, what about us? I wonder what we are really about when we listen most of the time. If we're honest, I think we might admit that we often, and I'm speaking for myself here too, that we often find that we listen just long enough to figure out what the other person is getting at so that we can then figure out what we want to say next. So as we're listening, we're actually formulating our response, or we're just waiting for them to get through what they need to say so that it's our turn to speak. It's so tempting because we're so in love with our own voice that what we really want most of all is for the other person to hear us. So how do we engage in the kind of depth hearing that Morton experienced? A hearing that with our whole being loves a person into speech, empowers a person to speak their true name, tell their true story. And what kind of church could you be if you nurture one another through that level of listening and caring? This is something that, of course, always happens imperfectly. We are always flawed people and we will never do things perfectly, but I see you already living into your covenant to nurture one another through your listening and caring in more ways than you might realize. I was so proud of the transition team for holding those listening sessions, for realizing that before they could speak into being or write into being your local church profile, they needed to first listen deeply to hear you all to speech about yourselves. What had gone right and what had gone wrong in the past? Where were you hurting? Where were you hoping? Where did you need healing? What direction were you yearning for the church to go in? And because they listened deeply, they were able to write a local church profile that beautifully manifested who you were at the time it was written. You also stretched beyond your normal patterns when, after COVID emerged, you began doing things a little differently. You began talking to different people when you gathered for Zoom coffee hour. You began connecting faces with names in new ways and discovering a kinship with different people rather than going to the same table down in coffee hour every week, right? You stretched yourselves, especially through the Called to Care team and council, to reach out to every member of the congregation and friend, active friend, to check in after we were no longer able to meet physically, especially with our more vulnerable and elderly members. A check-in that the Called to Care team continues to do with our vulnerable and more elderly members. You listen. You listened for technology needs. You reached out to one another and cared for one another by discerning that some people had stumbling blocks to accessing worship, and you helped them get connected. You also have found new opportunities to gather together in small groups over Zoom and get to know one another in new ways. Through Reverend Avina's Friday prayer group, which I invite you to try if you haven't yet, through our Thursday night for such a time as this group, through our Wednesday evening anti-racism small group, and in other ways. A new book club, for example. This is a sign. This is a sign of new life and new relationality, a newer and broader relational culture bubbling up in this church. The anti-racism group in particular, I just want to mention, is hearing one another into some pretty vulnerable speech about our own white privilege and about our familial and ancestral experiences with white supremacy. And now a new cohort of folks is going to be joining with an ecumenical group through Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon to join with a Reckoning with Racism process through the next 9 months to go deeper into a depth hearing about the way in which white supremacy in Oregon has affected the shape of our history and the experience of all communities, but most especially and detrimentally, communities of color. And what kinds of reparation and healing are needed? Well, another way you've been exploring more constructive ways to listen and communicate with one another is by experimenting with nonviolent or compassionate communication. Some of you attended the nonviolent communication workshop we had back in August. It was also held for the staff. It's been discussed further in council. And I want to say just a little bit about that. If you haven't dove into that yet, I recommend going to the website Rose City NVC. Rose City NVC. It contains the tools and the description of what is compassionate communication. And that is a way that we can learn to hear one another into speech. There's a metaphor that was developed to describe the kind of communication that is lifted up with this method. It's called the giraffe metaphor. The giraffe is the land animal with the largest heart and the longest neck, so it can see farthest into the landscape. And so the giraffe is used to describe compassionate communication. People are urged to listen with their giraffe ears. And that kind of listening, compassionate communication, is connecting to what is alive in the present with acceptance and compassion, and then taking action from that place of connection. And being a giraffe has two modes. It's receiving with empathy, receiving the other's speech with empathy, and it's expressing with honesty. This is really important. Receiving what others are saying with empathy rather than judgment, which is called being a jackal, and responding or expressing with honesty, and you might add vulnerability. When you're listening with giraffe ears, you're listening for the feelings and needs of the other underneath the words they are using. And this is a really important point. We often use jackal speech. We speak out of our pain. We speak out of a past history that contains baggage and resentments and fears and trauma. And so sometimes when we speak, we don't do it very effectively, and we don't always do it in a way that can be heard. So how do you live into your covenant of nurturing your relationships through listening and caring? You listen to one another with giraffe ears. You listen for the feelings and the needs that are universal feelings and needs underneath what may sound like pretty harsh speech. And one other really important thing to remember is that the only way you can really do that is to listen to yourself, to have empathy for yourself, and even deeper than that, theologically, we would say, to realize that we are all being listened to by God, that God is the one who allows us to be empathic towards ourselves because God first loved us, as the scripture testifies. So let's conclude with this. Going forward from here, as you transition from what I have found to be a beautiful interim journey with you, you will be transitioning into a time of a lot of excitement and perhaps a little turmoil as you go through one more change, as you welcome your new pastor into your midst. Now, when Reverend Eric arrives, it will be a chance for you to revisit your covenant with him and to deepen your covenant commitment to nurture one another through listening and caring. Reverend Eric, I know, has said on various occasions to the search committee and to you that he's committing to listen to you. And what has gone perhaps unsaid is that he will also need you to listen to him. I'm not talking about the kind of listening that is listening to obey or listening to follow. We don't have the hair pastor model in the United Church of Christ, that the pastor is some authority on high, that you need to listen to in the sense of blind following. No, but he needs you to listen to him, share his full self with you, to listen with giraffe ears to the story that he both articulates and leaves unsaid as he comes into your midst, to hear him into speech. And so I invite you to do what Nell Morton describes as depth hearing as you welcome your new pastor. Because listening like that is what will empower a new and liberating language to be formed between you and Reverend Eric, a language that will help get to the root of who you are and who you will be together as pastors and as congregation. As you listen to one another as pastor and congregation, as you listen below the words for the feelings and the needs and the requests that are coming forth, as you listen with empathy for yourselves and for Eric, and as you remember that God is listening to you, you will, I trust, manifest the beloved community that Paul describes in the book of Colossians. A community in which you are clothed with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. And so I offer you my greatest blessing and trust, for you are equipped to do the work that lies ahead of you, and you will go forth and do wonderful things. May it be so. Amen.